Hello, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the Exponent Philanthropy Annual Conference. My name is John Church, and I'm with Glenmead, an investment advisor based out of Philadelphia. I know that many friends and familiar faces are tuning in today, and thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to see you all again at a future Exponent event. We are going to dive into a subject that has been near and dear to me and to the missions of many foundations: how to activate the S, or social element, of ESG investing. I'm joined by two colleagues from Glenmead's Sustainable and Impact Investing team: Julia Enyart, who has spent much of her career researching and reporting on gender equity investment strategies, and she is the Vice President of Sustainable and Impact Investing at Glenmead. Also, Esma Bengabsia, who has written extensively about racial equity investment strategies, and she is a Senior Associate of Sustainable and Impact Investing, also at Glenmead. The three of us are going to share some stories and some background that can help extend your foundation's socially conscious investment strategies, as so many trustees are thinking about ways to extend their community outreach. Now, ESG investing has become fairly mainstream. The E element of ESG, which stands for environmental considerations, is tackling issues like climate-related pieces, energy efficiency, or biodiversity. And then there's the G element, which is the governance issues. So we're talking about things like board diversity and term limits, or board independence away from family members and other conflicts of interest. But when we talk about the possibilities with ESG investing, it's the S area, or the social area, which can be a little more vague. I think something that's relatable to foundations as we're emerging from the ongoing COVID crisis is bringing that social conversation toward gender and racial equity. We're talking about the way companies pay their workers or offer opportunities and promotions. And for investors, that means looking at the companies within their portfolio and asking, how does social practice influence corporate behavior? So here's a question for everyone. And I'd ask you to think about your own foundation's mission and the communities that you serve. How do you think your investment portfolio today aligns with gender equity or with racial equity? So here's a different question. How well represented are the managers in your portfolio? In other words, are they exhibiting qualities of gender and racial equity? Well, how about the companies that the managers are investing in? Is there equity there? And do you think your investment manager's processes are considering things like equitable treatment of employees? Is social justice a consideration? All right, so now I want to rephrase that first question. Do you think your foundation's investment portfolio is well aligned with your mission and the communities you serve? Maybe it is in some ways, maybe less so in other ways. And these are not easy questions for anyone to answer. Just before the pandemic, I joined the board of a foundation to help out with investments. This foundation focuses on mental health, especially in underserved communities. And we've wanted to align the investments with mission, but looking at our own portfolio, it's been difficult to understand if there was any intentional element toward racial or gender equity. And here we are 18 months later, I'm still asking a lot of these same questions. And it's no surprise, because today's reality is that corporate America really does not score very well. Only 1.3% of US assets are managed by firms owned by women or owned by people of color. And it's less than that for firms that are just owned by people of color. So in other words, 98 to 99% of assets are managed by white males, and that's hardly a reflection of our communities that we're serving. Most investment strategies also do hold companies or industries that probably could conflict with a foundation's mission. We all know that fiduciary duty obligates trustees to put investment performance first, and yes, that is absolutely a top priority. But there are more prudent and equitable ways to grow assets and align with mission. Foundations can add equity and justice as a top priority in their portfolios. They can use shareholder engagement, proxy voting, and adding resolutions to company ballots. All of this can happen right alongside the competitive financial performance that foundations need so dearly. And these are the topics that we're going to cover today. So if we take you to the agenda, what I'll first do is turn it over to Julia to talk more specifically about where gender and racial inequities exist in investments. Esma will then detail how foundations can find ways to invest and address these inequities. And then lastly, we'll bring it all together with a case study looking at one foundation and how they took steps to build an investment plan, effectively change their mindset, but also the mindsets of their advisors to build a more integrated and mission-aligned investment portfolio. All right, Julia, over to you.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with the Exponent Philanthropy audience today. I wanted to open up with a story about Mary, a woman just like any of us who feels eager to put her education and skill set to work. Mary is a mid-level employee with a marketing firm. Before the pandemic, she was on the verge of a promotion. Though her firm's margins were tight, Mary held onto her job throughout 2020, even amid the COVID-19 outbreak. She works in spurts while dually caring for a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, the youngest of whom needs close supervision and the oldest of whom has a learning disability. There have been times when Mary has the video off on a conference call, with one hand removing glitter from her child's cheek and with the other hand finishing up an analysis in Excel. Though Mary's relationship with her husband has generally been solid, the pandemic has underscored the imbalance in her own balance of who owns which household chores. Given that women take on an average of 7.7 more hours a week than men of unpaid childcare, Mary is no exception. She is exhausted and working regularly till midnight. She no longer feels well positioned for a promotion at her firm, and her job security suddenly feels fragile. Does this sound familiar? Over the last year, we've seen that inequity is on the rise, underscored by a widening wealth gap for women and people of color. Let's take a look at the headlines. Women's labor force hits a 33-year low in January, and the pandemic has derailed women's careers and livelihoods. Is America giving up on them? It can feel hard to believe that these articles are from 2021. More than 2.3 million women lost their jobs due to the pandemic. Recent research has highlighted that female-dominated sectors, including marketing, communications, and childcare jobs, which are most likely to be held by women, were shed most quickly. This moment has shed light on remaining gender inequities, but it's also important to acknowledge it's only exacerbating conditions that already existed. With this clear call to action in mind, we turn to the concept of gender equity investing, or investing for financial return while promoting gender diversity, equity, and inclusion. Investors across profiles, from high net worth individuals to endowments and foundations, are employing this approach to target outcomes for women and girls. Gender equity investing can be applied in 3 ways. Access to capital, or providing capital to female founders, perhaps even microfinance efforts to female groups. Workplace equity for women, which is where we focus the bulk of our research at Glenmead, including assessing the financial value of having women on boards and in senior management, as well as the policies and programs that support inclusive environments. And finally, products and services that benefit women and girls. This would include startups that, for example, offer at-home fertility testing, to caregiving services, to investment brokerage firms, catering to the idea that women tend to live longer than men and achieve a peak salary earlier in their career. Let's come back to this idea of workplace equity for women. We were finding that the majority of investments focus on women in boards and women in senior management. And while gender diversity at senior levels certainly matters, true gender equity requires a much more robust scorecard. We identified 5 core principles that investors should consider when evaluating gender equity. Of course, women in leadership is still a work in progress. Women represent only 28% of boards of S&P 500 companies, though studies repeatedly show that gender-diverse teams lead to higher return on equity and lower risk. We also consider access to benefits. While only 20% of private sector workers had access to paid family leave in 2020, we see evidence suggesting that offering maternal and paternal leave improve retention, reduce training costs, and promote home-life balance. And the third pillar focuses on pay equity. Women still earn 82 cents for every dollar earned by men, indicating an annual compensation gap of over $10,000. Compounded over a lifetime, women's pay gap can amount to nearly $500,000. And this gets worse when you factor in race, which we'll touch on in a bit. Investors should seek improved transparency and disclosure around pay equity to grow wealth, positively impact women, the economy, and investors alike. Let's shift to diverse supply chains. We think about this both in terms of venture capitalists sourcing new venture ideas from women, as well as companies prioritizing women-owned suppliers. We've got a way to go here. Women's share of venture capital funding shrank to 2.2% in 2020, even though overall VC funding increased during the pandemic. However, studies show that supplier diversity can offer a competitive advantage by sourcing new products and services and tapping into new supply bases, improving product quality and driving down costs. And these sourcing benefits extend to companies' supply chains, as well as venture capitalists who are sourcing new product ideas. Finally, we think about talent and culture. While no one standard for culture exists, studies repeatedly cite the role of professional development in creating a positive corporate culture for women. A McKinsey study of 70,000 employees found that men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in senior management. But this imbalance isn't due to attrition. As investors, we're looking for how companies are offering improved access to mentors and advocates, as well as clearly communicating anti-harassment policies, all of which can help foster an inclusive environment where women enter in at junior levels and find a clear path to the C-suite later on. If we go back to the story of Mary, let's assume that she's also a woman of color, which only deepens many of the structural inequities she faces. Mary is tempted to leave her role with the marketing firm and has dreams of becoming an entrepreneur. However, she can't turn to funding from friends and family because she doesn't have a high net worth network to invest in her idea. Though Mary is hardworking and an intelligent Black woman, she's unable to secure a business loan from a bank at any affordable interest rates. Let's zoom out to explore these racial inequities that are impacting Mary and more broadly communities of color across the US. In order for Mary, and really anyone, to prosper in society, she needs access to basic tools, including quality education, going to a good elementary school, leading to high school, and eventually a great college that she can go to because she's received scholarships, financial aid, which of course then leads to a good, well-paying job and a career that offers a livable wage and promotion opportunity. She needs access to capital, whether that's business loans, if she wants to start that business, home mortgages to buy a house at competitive rates, and assets to manage, so investments. She needs access to investments to grow her wealth. However, systemic barriers exist across all spaces for Mary and people of color in general. And education. Researchers assessed government funding that goes to school districts that are majority white versus majority non-white nationally, and they found that white majority school districts received $23 billion more in funding than majority non-white school districts. In terms of career, Harvard reported on a study where candidates of color and white candidates submitted identical resumes with some identifying factors. However, employers called candidates of color back at half the rate of their white counterparts. In terms of capital, research shows that banks and lenders in the US denied loans to businesses owned by people of color at 3 times the rate of that of white-owned firms. And even when financial institutions do offer people of color loans, they often offer lower principal amounts and charge higher interest rates than the loans providing to their white counterparts. And finally, in terms of investment, as John had mentioned before, we're seeing 1.3% of all assets owned or managed by women and people of color combined. When you break out race, it's even worse. Only 0.62% of assets under management in the US are managed by firms owned by people of color. These racial inequities are barriers that prevent people of color from accessing tools. And we see these racial inequities play out across sectors in the US. So, how as investors can we remove these barriers? In terms of education, we can look at investing in municipal issuances, where you might be supporting public universities and colleges that provide affordable access to educate communities of color. In terms of career, you might identify diverse companies that offer competitive pay equity, promotion, retention, and hiring inclusive programs and policies to not only get people into the firm, but help them stay there and grow careers in which they can thrive. In terms of capital, we can screen for predatory lenders, ensure access to equitable lenders, providing capital at fair rates. And in terms of investments, we can invest in diverse managers, asking if assets are owned and managed by people of color. We need to bring this back to our overall goal. In racial equity investing, we seek to remove barriers to help people thrive. So we often get asked by endowments, foundations, individuals that we work with, how can they focus not just on gender equity, but also racial equity? Recognizing that issues of inequity are intersectional. What does this mean? Intersectionality describes how various forms of inequality, whether gender, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, can overlap, creating even deeper experiences of oppression. Earlier, we mentioned that women's pay gap can amount to the loss of $500,000 over a lifetime, but these losses worsen when race is factored in. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women suffer a career earnings gap closer to $1 million. The pay gap is just one example of how, if you layer in gender and race in your investment analysis, you'll start seeing deeper disparities for women of color across sectors, including housing, access to jobs, quality education, food security, and access to capital. And as data is evolving, you can seek to use your investments to target the most vulnerable groups. Esma, let's walk through some investment opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Julia. So now let's go into what investment opportunities look like for foundations around both gender and racial equity to tackle all the inequities that Julia had mentioned and more. So there are three key elements that we look at for a well-constructed investment portfolio: an investment policy statement, or an IPS, a shareholder engagement, and then, of course, achieving competitive financial returns. So within an investment policy statement, that's really a plan to establish long-term goals and strategies. And as I'll go into in a moment, it's really important to think about how gender and racial equity considerations and social justice considerations more broadly may play into that. Shareholder engagement looks at engaging with companies that an investor, a foundation, might hold to get them to improve their racial and gender equity practices. And finally, achieving competitive financial returns is the core mission of the investment portfolio. As Dawn mentioned, fiduciary duty is of the essence. And so really looking at how to achieve the first and second components while also generating competitive financial returns. Now let's go into an investment policy statement. There are the standard governance and financial considerations within an IPS. And so defining the mission and the objectives of the investment portfolio, what the time horizon is, what the annual spending needs of the foundation may be, and then the fiduciary responsibilities around identifying the strongest financial investment opportunities for the portfolio. There are also gender and racial equity related considerations that a foundation can include within their IPS. So for example, exclusionary investment screens. For a foundation that's dedicated to racial equity, for example, that foundation might be committed to not invest in private prisons and the prison industrial complex. So thinking about what important exclusionary investment screens a foundation might want to incorporate and list within their IPS. Similarly, goals around positive investment screens, the target commitment level, shareholder engagement goals, and measurement and tracking. Now, a foundation can think about identifying opportunities to advance gender and racial equity across every step of the investment process. And so if you think about the flow of capital, the foundation trustees are managing the foundation's capital. They hire an investment advisor, and so they give their capital to the investment advisor, entrusting them to identify investment opportunities. That investment advisor then has that capital and is identifying investment strategies and companies to invest that capital in. So now the capital moves to the portfolio companies. Those portfolio companies are using the capital to run their business lines, generate profit, and then as they develop whatever good or service each company specializes in, they're presenting that to their consumers, and they're affecting any stakeholders across their supply chain process. So what are the opportunities that an investor can advance gender and racial equity across every single step of this investment process? So these are the action steps that one can take across each step. In terms of an investment advisor, a foundation and an investor can think about analyzing the gender and racial equity within their portfolio around manager diversity. And so as both Julia and John had mentioned, only 1.3% of assets under management in the US are managed by firms owned by women and people of color combined. And so if a foundation is interested in tackling that, they can work with their investment advisor to really set specific goals around the manager diversity that they would like to see represented within their portfolio. Around portfolio companies, foundation can think about what types of companies they're investing in and how those companies might either advance gender and racial justice and equity or exacerbate inequities. This can, for example, include considerations around diversity of leadership, the nature of the portfolio company's business lines, et cetera. And then finally, on consumers and stakeholders, foundations can consider what the outputs of those portfolio companies are and how it is they might have either positive or negative impacts around their surrounding communities and the consumers that they are serving, and again, any stakeholders who might be affected by the supply chain process. And so thinking about, for example, the financial inclusion platforms that Julia had referenced earlier, a financial inclusion platform that's focused on providing equitable access to capital for communities of color in the US obviously has a positive output toward its end consumers. And so that's an example of an investment that could be looked upon favorably within this portfolio. Now I'll pass it back to John to go through a specific case study.
Great. Thanks, Esma. So we're going to talk about how we helped one foundation bring gender equity investing ideas into action. And this foundation's mission is focused on empowering women and girls in underserved communities. Over the course of the COVID crisis, the foundation established some pretty big priorities, and most immediately, they wanted to increase community funding to address their grantees' urgent needs. But this then led them to think about how their investments were being managed and allocated. And they decided to explore how gender equity investing could help revitalize and focus their mission while at the same time advancing their identity in the community. So the process went through 4 steps. The first one was educating the trustees. How does gender equity relate to the foundation's mission? Why is it relevant for the future? How does this translate into guidelines and an updated investment policy? The second thing was education around specific gender equity investing strategies, tilting primarily toward more equitable companies, but also away from companies that were lacking diversity. What tools could be available and what might be most suitable for this foundation? Third, we help set goals and a framework with milestones to measure progress toward their goals. And as they move through the journey, the trustees could share their story with their community and serve as an example for others to follow their path while acknowledging that there's always more to be done. So one of the first things we discussed was the foundation's internal workings on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was an important component to reshape their mission and their grants focus. We heard from trustees and partners alike on their experiences through this process. And then we looked at whether the foundation's current portfolio did in fact align with gender equity. Well, probably not a surprise, it looked like the national averages. There really had not been an intentional effort to date, and nobody was really taken off guard by this. But among other priorities, the trustees conveyed this was indeed something they could put their time and energy into advancing. It's always a good idea to assign one trustee or a staff member to take ownership of the project to really keep focused and moving it forward. And as the investment advisor, we drew on our experiences with other foundations and nonprofits, and we provided a couple of examples as to how gender equity investing could tie back to the mission. We also noted that there were a couple of underlying investment strategies where gender equity was a little better than expected, and that was a pleasant surprise. It made the whole exercise a little more relatable and promising as well to the trustees. Esma, why don't I turn it back to you to talk about some of the investment strategies that could advance gender equity for this foundation?
Absolutely. Thanks, John. So next, we looked at investment strategies within 2 categories. One, we looked at strategies that can help us mitigate risk. And so thinking about, for example, financially material, social, and governance issues around gender equity and how they might play out in the companies in the portfolio. And then we also looked at what sectors and what types of companies is this foundation interested in screening out because of their negative impact, particularly around gender equity. So for example, thinking about companies with no women on their boards, companies within the adult entertainment sector, et cetera. And then on the right side of the slide, we thought about what companies are creating positive impact and advancing gender equity proactively. So for example, companies that have equitable policies and programs that are seeking to achieve or might already have pay equity, equity and representation of women across seniority levels. Additionally, investment strategies that are using shareholder engagement to engage and advance companies around their gender equity. So if a company does not have sufficient female representation on its board or within its seniority levels, or does not have workplace policies that are supportive to advancing female representation and mobility within the company, then engaging with them to advance those practices. And then finally, focusing on specific impact outcomes. For example, affordable housing opportunities or community development investment programs that, again, are seeking to generate competitive financial returns, but are also creating these specific thematic impact outcomes for underserved women and girls. Next, we worked with this foundation to set and measure specific and quantifiable goals around gender equity. Some of these metrics include, again, percent of women on the leadership of these companies. Additionally, including percent of the portfolio that might have exposure to either, again, positive tilts around gender equity or negative ones. So as you can see at the bottom here, we have a percent of the portfolio that might be within companies that have business involvement in adult entertainment, alcohol, and tobacco, and again, seeking to minimize that to 0%. And so we measured where the portfolio currently stands and then set quantifiable goals around where the portfolio should be within X amount of time. And so we worked closely with this foundation to assess the status quo, the current standing, set the goals, and then work toward achieving them over time. Now, importantly, what gets measured gets managed. And so being able to set this data dashboard and really look at what the numbers are and how we can get closer to our goals helps us really track our progress and then also maintain consistency in achieving those goals within a specific amount of time. So now I'll pass it back to Julia.
Thanks, Esma. Just as important as measuring progress internally is reporting out that progress and your increased impact externally. In fact, we find that foundations are uniquely positioned to take advantage of gender equity investing. By telling the story of your work to your community, you illustrate an investment strategy that's in lockstep with the foundation's mission. Moreover, you intentionally align invested dollars with the foundation's mission and purpose. You tell a holistic story. You encourage equitable corporate behavior and avoid risk. You stand out as a leader in the field, and you gain the opportunity to invest locally in support of community programs. We do want to emphasize that though this specific case study focused on a foundation aligned with gender equity, a similar framework and process could equally be applied to foundations who are emphasizing racial equity. Let's bring it all together with a roadmap of how your foundation can build a plan to advance your respective missions, in this instance, on gender equity. First, seek to build awareness, which involves educating the board and investment committee and exploring if this is in fact a priority. Next, we see foundations look inward, seeking to analyze the gender equity metrics of their current portfolio, as John had discussed, and how that stacks up against the market benchmarks, exploring any gender-aligned suggestions from their investment advisor. Finally, foundations seek to set goals, as Esma covered, identifying 3 to 5 year targets for expanding gender equity across a range of metrics, modifying their investment policy statement to be more intentional, and challenging their investment advisors to offer solutions to ensure this cohesive narrative. We've had the privilege of working with another foundation seeking thematic exposure across their assets to diversity, equity, and inclusion again, but this time specifically focused on racial equity. We spent a lot of time with the board on education to dig into motivations and shared priorities. The board reviews each racial equity strategy that we propose along the way. We talk through strategies in public markets, including strategies that are person of color owned and managed, as well as strategies that have racial equity baked into that investment thesis in every investment they do. We've also talked through private investments that focus on affordable housing, for example, including for communities of color. While there's no one solution, the key is to keep the conversation moving forward and pushing for progress against foundation goals. So today we've covered a multi-pronged approach to activating the social factors of ESG in your portfolios. We touched on representation, so looking at gender and racial diversity of the managers managing your assets. We touched on equity, what products and services the companies in your portfolios invest in. Do they invest in private prisons, predatory lenders, adult entertainment, or other sectors that amplify inequities for women and people of color? And then finally, justice. Do you think about the implications of your investments on grassroots communities, or think through using shareholder engagement to really advocate for greater gender and racial justice? The good news is that there's plenty of research and emerging frameworks to help guide your journey, including several pieces from Glenn Mead, which are shown here. These are deep dives in gender equity and racial equity investing, to case studies that show how other foundations have gone on this journey and how they've then taken advantage of their unique position to tell their story. Whether the foundation is simply dipping their toe in the water or embracing a 100% approach, there are tools to meet you where you are and ensure that your portfolio is a reflection of the incredible work that your foundation is doing. Thanks so much for your time. You'll have an opportunity to connect with the Glenn Mead team and these speakers at the speaker chat later today. Hope to see you there.